Hello, everybody, and welcome to Classroom Psychology. I'm your host, Cora. Thank you so very, very, very much for joining me. It is wonderful to see you. Grab a drink, whatever your favorite imbibement is. Grab a chair. Let's sit down together and talk gender diversity together, shall we? You know, just for a change. Let's talk about gender diversity. And what do we do here? We take this week, much like we do every time we come together, we take the confident statements from public figures, often, you know, very confident in their declaration, sometimes from a famous book author, sometimes from the President of the United States, sometimes, as in this case, from an investigative journalist, and we take their statements for the questions we're sure they're intended to be, and we see if we can't find an answer together by reviewing the scientific literature, or in this case, interviewing an expert in the field. So this week we have an interesting question from Christina Buttons, who's an investigative journalist working for the Manhattan Institute. Really interesting. She has some interesting things to say about gender diversity. So without further ado, let's hear from this week's question asker, Christina Buttons.
I think that it's mostly like teenage girls who are showing up to gender clinics today. And I feel like at least some proportion of them are probably young girls who, haven't yet received an autism diagnosis, or if they have, like, they're maybe attributing their experiences to gender when they're actually like maybe better understood as like an autistic trait.
Thanks so very much to Christina Buttons for such an interesting question, posed as they often are in the form of, inquisitive question kind of stroke declaration. But we'll take their question for the question we're sure is intended to be, and we'll see if we can't find an answer together. We've covered the intersection of neurodivergence and gender diversity before, trying to explain the seeming overrepresentation of each community in the other. And yet we didn't really get to talking about experiences at that intersection or the challenges of what might be something we can talk about here, which is a bit of intersectionality and visibility, maybe, when one of your minority identities gets magnified and the other kind of gets ignored, maybe a little bit invisibilized, or in this case, perhaps a touch invalidated. So we have, listen, there's great literature, I'm sure, but there's no substitute for asking an expert about this when they have done research in this field. And we have the inimitable, the indefatigable Dr. Abigail Vines to talk to us about gender diversity and neurodivergence and the experiences at the intersection of both, and what it's like to experience multiple marginalised identities. What happens to people who experience those things? So, and what can schools do? What can schools do to help to create a world where everyone can find a place to belong? I am genuinely thrilled that you get to spend some time with Dr. Abigail Vines. I was extremely lucky, fortunate, overjoyed to get to see her present on an international stage in Vienna. And I am so glad that you get the chance to spend some time with her here. So here is the legendary Dr. Abigail Vines. So thanks very much, hey, Dr. Abby Vines, for giving up your time so generously to talk to us about the work. I think your work is super interesting, has already reached an international audience, is now with journal editors, and has been quite important, I think, in helping us all to understand a particularly useful and important intersection between gender diversity and neurodiversity. Can I ask a bit? I mean, just get us started. Like, why did you want to do this piece of, like, these pieces of work? What drew you to doing this in particular?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting one, because I think, everything we do in life, it has a personal angle, doesn't it? And you have to be personally motivated and passionate about something to make it work, especially when you're writing such big papers and there's such big parts of your life. So I knew, but I didn't know what I wanted to do early on in the doctorate, but I knew early on I wanted to do something which would support people and be a practical piece of research that could impact change. And I wanted to make sure that that change was for some of our most vulnerable populations. Just for a bit of context, I myself, I grew up in a single parent family in Grimsby, which is quite economically deprived. I lived in a council flat with my mum and my 4 siblings, and my mum has quite significant mental health needs. My little brother is autistic. My sister has ADHD. I myself have dyspraxia and dyslexia. So there were quite a few difficulties that we had to navigate as a family when we were younger. And I look back at my time in school and I couldn't read properly till the age of 12. And I just hid it so well and nobody knew. And there was just so much shame within it. And I just felt like my school experience was so impacted by that. And working as a trainee educational psychologist, I just felt like not that much had changed for people who are neurodivergent, if I'm really honest. And I know it has for some, but I think the landscape isn't that much different to what it was 20 years ago when I was 10. So I really wanted to do something that would support young people who are in that position. But again, I wanted to do more and I wanted to reach more people. So I knew I wanted to do something around vulnerable young people. And I knew I wanted to do something around intersectionality because we're seeing more and more that individuals belong to more than one minority group.
Right.
So I wanted to think around that. But because obviously I had the joy of doing 2 different papers, I wanted to look at 2 different things. So for my systematic literature review, I really wanted to look at multiple intersecting identities and compare that kind of journey of identity and self-development, because that hasn't really been done. And studies will look very specifically at 1 intersection or maybe 2 intersections, but they do it in isolation in a particular place at a particular time. So I wanted to kind of, cross-reference different papers and have a look to see kind of what the trends were, what the similarities and what the differences were in identity development for those people with intersecting identities. But for my empirical paper, I wanted to do something a bit more specific. And as I'm sure you are fully aware, a lot of the listeners listening to this will know, we are seeing more and more individuals who identify as neurodivergent and gender divergent. But we also know that these are 2 of our most vulnerable young populations, and they report the lowest mental health outcomes out of any youth group, with gender divergent young people being the group that experience the highest level of suicidal ideations and self-harm. And we're seeing with neurodivergent young people, we're seeing more and more individuals not attending school because of their mental health and being in a real mental health crisis. So I really, really wanted to look at this population that we're seeing growing, because there's no research on these young people and their mental health. However, we also know from separate research that school really impacts the mental health of each of these 2 populations. So I really wanted to do a piece of research that looked at the mental health in schools of young people who identify as both neuro and gender divergent. And nothing like that has been done yet. No research has been done around the voices of young people who are gender and neurodivergent. The closest thing we have so far is research around autistic people who identify as gender divergent, but we haven't gone into the wider scope. So very long way of saying I wanted to combine my own experiences and where I was seeing gaps in research to really, really create a purposeful piece of research that will help lead the way for these young, vulnerable people.
Super. I mean, a hugely valuable piece of work. And there's something quite, I mean, the concept "they're never about us without us" is always a valuable one to guide work like this. And it's always really wonderful to see people with a personal experience taking aim at trying to empower the voices of other marginalized folk. Can I ask, so one of the things that was really interesting in what you said, loads of really interesting things, but something that struck me that I wasn't expecting is that you mentioned that these 2 populations, gender diverse folk, neurodivergent young people, have the weakest mental health outcomes. I was super surprised by that. Do you have a sense of, I know you mentioned shame and masking, and I don't know if in my head I'm putting those 2 things together in a way that they don't deserve to be, but do you have a sense of, is that the case? And do you have a sense of why?
I think so. And I think kind of from obviously reading quite a lot of research in the field, I couldn't give you a definitive answer because I think it's so subjective. And I think mental health is impacted by so many different things for so many different people. But for me, reading the research, speaking to young people in those populations, my understanding is, yes, sometimes, low mental health outcomes come from feeling that shame, But really, I think it comes from a lack of belonging, because I think
Wow.
I there's a lot in my research, but I kind of talk about these divergent people having to live in a non-divergent world where society doesn't really accept divergence, and the world isn't really built for these people, and schools aren't really built for neurodivergent and gender divergent young people. You're meant to kind of follow a path, and if you don't follow the path, and if you don't fit in, then you kind of fall through the cracks.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of young people are experiencing that feeling. And obviously, if you feel like you are the odd one out, your belonging is then impacted. And then if you don't feel like you belong, you then have a lower sense of self,
Right.
and you have a lower sense of self-worth. And then that is where we see people's mental health really, really plummet and decrease, which is really, really sad. But I think like I said, I think there's a lot of factors, and I think the young people are juggling so much, but I think it fundamentally comes down to a lot of young people who are divergent don't feel supported, they don't feel seen, they don't feel understood, and then that impacts the belonging and the mental health and so on and so forth.
Really interesting. Yeah, a couple of episodes ago, in our last video episode, we were talking to Dr. Fionn Davies about essentially about belonging and identity in adolescence, and how in Fionn's case, we were talking about young boys and men trying to learn to belong in a world where, some of their inherent abilities like empathy and sensitivity are kind of squashed out in order to belong. Can you talk us through, do you have a sense of it? Is masking, like, what is masking and why do people do it?
Okay. So I think, and again, there are different elements of masking, and I think other practitioners in the field might have a different definition of it to me.
Sure.
But my understanding of masking is basically when you are concealing your true feelings or true behaviours in order to protect yourself as a sense of safety. And within masking, you may also camouflage. So if you are camouflaging, you are mimicking behaviours.
Wow. Okay.
And maybe styles and different things like that. You are mimicking things in order to fit. So if we're thinking of like a chameleon camouflaging into the surroundings, that's what I describe camouflaging as. But I would say that fits under the bigger umbrella of masking, which is hiding your true feeling or true behaviours in order to protect yourself. And I think, kind of to answer your question, Cora, around the relationship between masking and shame, I think shame is I don't know, I feel like shame has become a dirty word that we shouldn't use, that is bad, but we all feel shame sometimes. It's a very normal emotion, but I feel that when people are masking, they feel shame, or perhaps embarrassment is a better word, shame or embarrassment about their true feelings, their true identity, their true behaviours. And that, personally, I think that is a big factor as to why people mask, because they feel shame, they feel worry of being judged, they feel embarrassment. So in terms of a survival strategy, they instead mask because it feels safer and more comfortable than being their true selves.
Right. So, gosh, interesting that masking and camouflaging are kind of, camouflaging sits within masking, like it's a form of masking, but is more...
I believe it to be anyway.
Gotcha. Hey, you're the expert in the room. Your view here is what I'm after, for sure. And so fascinating. So masking and camouflaging, people camouflage in order to fit in, consciously deciding to do something which allows them to fit in better. And then masking is this kind of broad umbrella term for both external and internal features that people change about themselves in order to fit in better. Wow.
And I think what we need to remember is that some people have masked for so long and so subconsciously from such a young age that a lot of people don't really know who they are, and they don't know their true self, and they don't have a strong sense of selfhood. And going back to how that impacts mental health, obviously mental health then becomes really low because they don't know who they are, and then that brings about conflicts and confusion and uncertainty. And it just all comes together as just a cocktail of chaos that can just really, really impact the way a person feels about themselves.
Fascinating to know. I say fascinating all the time in these interviews. Every couple of seconds I say the word fascinating because it's always fascinating. But I really like the idea that masking and identity and belonging are all kind of tangled in with each other, that if you're in a normative society, I say normative society, if there are a set of rules and norms that you don't fit in with very easily, then the pursuit of belonging involves masking to try to kind of find a place to belong. Does it work? I mean, is that an effect? Given that's what people do, can it work?
It's interesting. And I mean, I would encourage people who are listening to this interview to think about themselves and think if they've ever masked anything to fit in, because I think it can work. It absolutely can work. It's a coping mechanism. It's a survival mechanism. And often those things do work. You do manage to survive. However, if somebody is masking themselves completely and they're getting to the point where they don't know who they are, then they're not living authentically. And not living authentically can really, really impact your sense of self and your mental health. And quite often it can work for a time for people. But like any coping mechanism, sometimes I describe it as like a plaster. You put the plaster on, you mask for a while, it can help for a while. But eventually it's not going to work anymore. It's like putting a plaster on a hole in a bath and filling the bath up with water. It lasts for a little bit, but not forever. And eventually those feelings and those emotions and those behaviours are going to come out, because that's your authentic self. And having spoken to quite a few individuals who are neurodivergent and gender divergent through interviews in my empirical paper, they just spoke about how exhausting that was.
Wow.
And whilst they seemed okay on the surface and like they were fitting in and they had friends, they were exhausted, because it is exhausting. It's like playing someone else. It's like acting, like living a double life. I mean, it's knackering. And I think a lot of the people that I spoke to just basically said they just got to a point where they couldn't do it anymore. And they were just in mental health crises. And they were just like, okay, I'm going to just have to be myself. I'm going to just have to be authentic, because I can't carry on with this.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of individuals, COVID was quite a big moment for them in terms of they couldn't mask anymore. All of the distractions, everything was gone. And they were just forced to kind of be like, okay, I'm exhausted. This is me. Let's go with it. Like, yeah, let's move. But yeah, I mean, it's just so difficult.
So, the idea of authenticity is quite interesting. I don't think we've considered the concept of authenticity before on the podcast. I don't think I've pondered that authenticity is like the part of you that kind of gets suppressed in order to mask, I guess, right? And I think I have read somewhere about authenticity being important in belonging. Am I on the right track there?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's kind of like, it's like we were saying now about masking. You can mask and then you can belong, but are you really belonging if you're not sharing your own self, your own, like your opinions, your views? It's fake. It's fake. So it's just not really true. So yeah, in order to belong fully, you have to show your authentic self, because otherwise it's not real. And that will then impact your mental health as well, and how you see yourself further, because it's not real. So yeah, it goes hand in hand.
I guess that fits with things like the neurodiversity movement, the hearing voices movement, even the kind of plurality and multiplicity movement, you know, as people start to find community and realize that, you know, their authentic selves are not alone in the world, in whoever they are, in however they experience things. So I guess that is a bit of a challenge, though, in school, because schools don't, you know, the only thing you have in common with the people you're thrown into school with is your age, really, right? And you live in roughly the same place. So it must be quite hard to find a sense of your authentic self being reflected in the people around you. You know, if they are looking for their tribe in school and finding it difficult, I guess the concept of intersectionality must become relevant there too, because even if you were to find a group of people who are queer, that's not necessarily a group of people who are queer and who then understand neurodiversity in that space, right?
Exactly. And some individuals I interviewed, and again, just kind of through my systematic lit review and further research, a lot of individuals feel very ostracized within different minority groups when they are at an intersection of such. So a lot of research I looked into, particularly about young people who are queer and disabled or neurodivergent, a lot of them didn't feel accepted in some queer communities because they weren't seen to be queer enough, because of their disability or because of their divergence, or that, it sounds silly, but that almost overshadowed how individuals saw them, and other minority individuals could just see that one minority as opposed to their queer identity as well.
That something that that I think I learned from working with you on this work was the concept of intersectionality invisibility theory, I think it's called. Can you
Yes, yes,
nodding?
yes.
Can you talk us through it, like conceptually? What is that?
I know. I basically just explained it, and I didn't say what it
You
was.
did it brilliant. I thought it was brilliant. But it's cool to think that people have actually studied this concept that you found in your own work. Like,
yeah, definitely. So intersectionality invisibility theory is the idea that when you belong to more than one minority group, often one of your minority identities is amplified and the other is repressed. So those becoming invisible, basically. So those identities that you have, let's say you have 2 or 3 or even 4 different minority identities that you belong to, they're never seen as equal by people around you. One is always magnified, whilst another can be repressed or just ignored. So that's basically what it means, that some things are heightened, some things are lesser, but that's not based on the individual's choice. That's based on the perceptions and misconceptions and the understanding of those people around them. So, like, for example, if we're looking again at the research I looked into about young Black women and their experiences at school, a lot of the young Black women who were interviewed shared that they felt that their identity as women were ignored because they were Black, and that was all people could see.
wow.
And again, for a lot of young individuals who are disabled and queer, their queer identity was ignored because of their disabilities and because of people's perceptions that they couldn't make their own decisions because of cognitive needs and things like that.
Interesting.
And again, quite often, if we're thinking specifically about neurodivergent and gender divergent individuals, with the individuals that I interviewed for my study, a lot of them spoke about how they were reluctant to share with people their true gender identities because they felt that that would kind of that would magnify,
Wow.
and then the other identities would be ignored.
Wow.
And wouldn't be taken seriously, as it were, because of perceptions of the trans community and the gender divergent community.
That's interesting. I had never put those two things together. So it could, because some things that we've heard from from the press and from commentators often is framing gender diverse young people who are neurodivergent as being quite vulnerable and suggestible, and therefore that their sort of gender diversity can get a bit invalidated because of their neurodivergence. So I didn't.
And I feel that's why so many people are so reluctant to share a gender identity, because they feel it will come into focus or it won't be accepted, or that is all people will see, but not necessarily for the right reasons.
Right. Gosh. I mean, it makes perfect sense, doesn't it? I mean, that fits with why young people might find it very difficult to be, again, authentic in their intersectionality because of the fear that part of their identity is going to become magnified, and the other, which might also be extremely relevant to their identity, might become minimized or become completely invisible.
And it's just like it's just a horrible reality, isn't it, that these individuals at young ages have to think so complexly about their safety to the point where they're not going to be their authentic selves because they are genuinely worried about that. What an awful situation to be in. It's just horrible that that's the case. Absolutely horrible.
How do young people navigate that then? Is that how masking begin? Like, is that a role that masking takes, where people say, well, I'll reveal this part of my identity, but I'll mask this part because it becomes too complicated for people to perceive?
Absolutely. And I think, again, what we also have to remember is that we live in a society where some labels are more accepted and understood than others as well.
Right.
So I think a lot of people in divergent communities are quite reluctant as well to share the divergent identities whilst they're still figuring it out. Because I think a lot of people worry about the judgment and the shame of identifying as something and then maybe trying that label on and saying, oh, actually, that's not what suits me best. This suits you best. And yeah, I think, and I don't think it should be the case, but I think a lot of people who are divergent feel that they have to have it all figured out before they share things with people. And it just shouldn't be the case, because it's not the case for other things that are more acceptable. For example, nobody would ever judge you for applying to a university to do a particular degree and then changing your mind and finding one that's more suitable for you. Nobody's ever judged that. So I just don't understand why people are judging individuals for trying on labels that suit them, don't suit them. The concept baffles me, and it's just such a shame that is the case. But I think that is why young people mask, and I think young people wait until they find something that feels authentically them to share it. But again, some people never do, and some people live their whole lives in shame because they're worried about being that authentic self. And I just don't think you can truly know if a label fits you until you experiment with it and see how it goes. But people, understandably, don't feel comfortable to do that.
That fits perfectly with the way that I'm thinking about this. The idea that, because it feels like there's a sort of unstoppable force meeting an immovable object, or at the very least, like a juxtaposition where at once young people, we want them to authentically be able to define their identities, and for those identities, as they always do for all people, evolve and change over time. But young people, we also kind of put them in a position where when they tell us about their identities, we tend to perceive them as fixed, which is a paradox. Yeah. And in so doing, where young people feel they can't let people know until they're certain or until they're sure, it might inhibit their ability to experiment and to try on identities and for those identities to evolve with experience.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Wow. Really interesting. And I guess that fits with fits with the challenges of the medical community and medicalization, because the medical community and medicalization of these issues is absolutely one that is set up to perceive things as fixed rather than as changing over time. So if you were to set up some kind of system that allowed people to find themselves more easily, that sort of maybe a sidestep from the medical system we have now, maybe one that educational psychologists could step into, what would it be? What would you want EPs to do to build something that allows people to find themselves more easily?
It's a tricky one, isn't it? Because if we think about the medical model, and if we think about the way that we now perceive neurodivergence, so neurodivergence was always around the medical model as well, but we're now moving away from that slightly to an extent. Obviously, diagnoses still happen, and diagnoses are still important for some individuals. Some people don't find them so important, but that is still within the realm. But I do think we're going kind of more towards a social model of neurodivergent understanding, and it kind of being led by the person and how they feel. Yeah. And again, I think kind of labels around neurodivergence are becoming more flexible. I think a lot of individuals now prefer to be labeled as neurodivergent. And again, if we just think about kind of how obviously labels like Asperger's used to be used, autism spectrum disorder, then condition. Now a lot of people just prefer autism. And we're seeing kind of that flexibly change and move in quite a social manner based on feeling. I think in terms of gender, it is a tricky one in terms of obviously that. But again, if you think about some neurodivergences, there are medical implications here. And, there are big decisions that young people do make within this. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that. However, there are so many steps before we get to that point. And I think it's really, really important to see it from a more social angle as opposed to a medical angle earlier on. And I think kind of to answer your question about what that could look like and what EPs could do, I think, more resources need to be out there in a safe space for young people to just be able to be like, I feel like this. What does that mean? I think gender I was going to say dysphoria,
yeah.
kind of, so gender dysphoria and kind of that kind of conversation. I think that needs to come earlier as well, because at the moment, and again, you might be, I might be wrong, Cora, but I'm pretty sure that you could only be diagnosed with gender dysphoria after a certain amount of time if you tick off a certain amount of symptoms, which again is bizarre to me, because it's a feeling, it's how you feel. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that and we hold that for these young people. And then from there, we say, okay, well, how are you feeling? And then actually pointing them to appropriate services to explore safely. Because I think what we have to remember here is that there, at the moment, aren't safe spaces for these young people to talk about this stuff that are socially acceptable. And there aren't safe spaces for these people to explore. So they're doing it in sometimes an unhealthy way, through chat rooms that aren't regulated. We don't know who these young people could be speaking to. We don't know what they're being told. And it's really, really important that trained professionals are supporting these individuals and hearing them, seeing them, kind of validating their feelings, and then directing them to that appropriate support to be able to really, really safely explore. Because we see it so much. We see so many suicides in young people who just haven't had that support, and then try something and it still doesn't feel right, and they don't feel like they have any other option. But that just shouldn't be the case. We need to normalize exploration of this, because if we don't, more and more young people are going to die, and it doesn't need to be the case.
It reminds me of Dr. Anthimu many weeks ago, talking about that just making space can be a huge step, because people, if you establish that you are a safe person and you create a safe space, people will come and talk to you about themselves.
Of course they will. Yeah, definitely. But it's just being that consistent safe space as well, isn't it? And I think so many people in this community just feel so judged. And every person I've ever spoken to who identifies as gender divergent has countless stories of judgment, shame, feeling embarrassed about their identity. And that never comes from within. It comes from experiences with professionals. And I just think, oh my goodness, this just shouldn't be the case. And obviously, people are then reluctant to share, and those spaces don't feel safe. So absolutely, it's about building a consistent safe spaces that are non-judgmental.
That's a useful concept, actually. I don't think I had thought about the idea of consistency, and that it might like be a virtuous cycle, that as people, you create space, people talk about their experience and they feel safe within that space, then it becomes, other people will come forward and feel safe. And so you create something that's more consistent and lasting. And is that like one way we can start to change school culture, by creating spaces like that?
I think so. And I think and again, I'd be reluctant to say that every school should follow a very, very specific framework, because I think obviously this is subjective. This is based on an individual. You need to know the individuals in your school. But I do think there needs to be kind of more regimented regulations of what things should look like, so that there is that consistent support amongst individuals within the same school, amongst different schools in the same area and across the country as well. Because one thing that kind of really stands out to me when I speak to individuals in this community is just how different everybody's experience is, and how particular teachers who are trained or understand or have a gender divergent friend or individual in their life, those individuals get such better care because those people get it.
Right.
But that just shouldn't be the case. And I think absolutely it starts with training. It starts with conversation, sharing, having this out in the open, and increasing other people's understanding. Because I think so many people want to support this population, but they don't know where to begin. And I think as well, in the UK, we are terrible for this. I think kind of people are afraid to share what they don't know, because they don't want to look ignorant, and they don't want to look like a bad person. But not knowing doesn't make you a bad person. Not asking can, though. And I think it's that sounds really harsh, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because that becomes a vicious cycle. It's okay to not know. It's absolutely fine. You have to ask the questions. You have to do that exploration. And I think I'm making it sound like it's such a small job. It's not. It's obviously huge, but I do think we need to change that societal narrative of this, actually, because I think for so many people who I've spoken to through the process of this research, just being asked is all they want. Just being seen, that's all they need.
Wow,
That's all anybody wants.
So huge. And it reminds me of it feels like an evolution of the, like, I think it originated in Australia, the Gay Straight Alliance intervention, which was just like, let's bring together like people across the spectrum of sexual diversity, and we'll create space where essentially it's a space where people who are sexually diverse can feel belonging. And with sort of heterosexual allies all coming together to create space. And it feels like here your suggestion speaks to like an intersectional alliance, like space that is safe, that appreciates people's individual unique experience, and that by amplifying those experiences and understanding them and asking the question, we can then create sort of school cultures where more people can find a place to belong, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And that's the thing. And I think kind of for me doing this research, I've had to just really acknowledge my privilege, in a sense. Not everyone has the same privilege. And it's about asking and being curious, but not in a derogatory way either, because, it's not that these people need help and they need something greater than anyone else. They just need to be seen. And I have that privilege of being a cisgender individual, that I've just always had that, but people have just seen me that way, and not everyone has that. And I think it's really, really important for individuals to check their privilege and actually remember that not everyone has that. So we have to create that privilege for people. We have to be that change.
Yeah.
Because it's not good enough to just be like, it's rubbish. No, that we have to change it, because this just can't be the case forever. It just simply can't.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's an important message, that, being aware of our own privilege and using that privilege to amplify the voices of folk who are marginalized in order that they can find a more equal place to belong, especially in school, sounds really important. So what do we need to do then? Like, I love the idea of an intersectional alliance. I think that's a cool approach.
It is.
How do we create settings that better represent the people? Is it about representation? Like, how do we do this? What's like, rather than trying to kind of change the world, because I think that's my temptation, what's like some baby steps that we can take? Like, if school staff could do like a couple of things today that might just make their worlds a little bit more inclusive of intersectional experiences, kind of what would they be?
So I think the first one really, and again, obviously this is easier with older students and younger students, but I think it's asking young people if they do identify as any minorities, and if so, which ones, is there any support they'd like with that? And I think it's empowering young people. And some young people might not know, and that's okay, but I think it's about tutors, form tutors, trusted adults, just having that conversation now and again with young people. And again, I think it's about bringing it into the PSHE and the RSE curriculum, because none of this is discussed in that curriculum. And fundamentally, I think people worry about talking about things like this because, as you said earlier, Cora, some of these populations are vulnerable, and people think they're going to be kind of shooed into identifying a way. But fundamentally, I just completely disagree. Knowledge is power, and you need to have. It's like if you're building a house, you can't build the house with the correct tools. You can't appropriately label your authentic self and understand your authentic self if you don't know it, if you don't have all the knowledge. So I think fundamentally it comes down to knowledge sharing, but also, as I kind of alluded to earlier, staff understanding. So I think if we kind of think about the schools and educational systems before we think about the teachers, I think a national programme of understanding around different divergent identities needs to come into play, and staff need to have that. And again, that can be done through educational psychology services. I know that's something that kind of I'd like to kind of create within my career and kind of support schools with and plug into it. But again, I do think it's also about kind of ownership and responsibility too. And I think it's about kind of the local authority, the government, the educational psychology service, all these people holding schools accountable and saying, okay, well, what are you doing to support these divergent students? What are you doing to keep up to date with what supports them? Because I honestly, and this is a very cynical thing to say, but I worry that if I went into every school in the country and I asked every head to define neurodivergence and gender divergence and tell me exactly what support plans they have in place for these young people, I'd worry about the answers. And I'd worry that not every head would have a system in place or would have a strong understanding of what divergence looks like in school and in the classroom. And that's no shade and that's no judgment on individuals. But I think because we have so many pressures around academia, I think these things get forgotten. But if a young person doesn't feel comfortable in themselves, they're not school ready, and if they're not school ready, then they can't do well. So to me, it's a no-brainer. So I think yes, it starts with kind of holding schools more accountable and making sure that they are giving their staff space and a safe space to have those conversations among kind of the staff team to develop their understanding, and then that then needs to trickle into the students. They need to kind of be asked if they need support. That needs to come into PSHE, RSE, but also just more general conversations. It just needs to be normalised amongst different students as well. And I think another thing as well, especially in terms like neurodivergence and disability, a lot of people I spoke to through this research showed that they just felt that classrooms weren't very divergent friendly in the sense of things are taught one way and they're not allowed to kind of use fidget toys or listen to music or things like that. So I just think it's also a bit about flexibility, but also giving individuals an understanding of what might help and kind of, just not having that one size fits all thing. If you're teaching something in one way, teach it in another, and just empower people to have a go at things, I think are our kind of biggest things that need to happen first.
I really like the idea that, as educators, we can learn and teach. We learn about these concepts and ideas. We teach about these concepts and ideas so that we will have a shared kind of language. And then we learn from the students about their experience and how we could do things better and become more inclusive. Exactly. I really like that approach.
Yeah. Because that's the thing. And I think nobody who is divergent is expecting anybody to have all the answers or be able to wave a magic wand. Right. They just want to be seen. I mean, I think, and I can't speak for every divergent individual, but if you get something wrong, if you get a support structure wrong, if you say the wrong name, if you are saying it with genuine mistake, if you are trying, people are not going to be offended because you are trying. It's having that open conversation. But it's, as I was kind of saying earlier, if people are too scared to try, that's where we get into trouble. Yes. And that's where shame occurs. And that's where masking happens. And that's where mental health outcomes really suffer.
It's brilliant. Try and get it wrong and try some more. I like it.
And it's okay. And we need to introduce that to our culture more. It's the culture of failing. It's okay to fail. It's about what lesson that teaches you and growing from it. If you never try, it's not good enough.
It's wonderful. So as we get close to the end here, there's a question that has become a bit of a tradition on the podcast now. And it's a question because, and this is genuinely true, I do get emails in from young people who listen to the podcast. And for sure, I'm imagining that will be folk listening to this one, hearing your words. If you were to give a message to young folk, maybe at that intersection or at any intersection, and they're feeling maybe ashamed, maybe they're masking, maybe they don't feel like they will necessarily belong, what might your message to them be?
Oh gosh, I'd love to give so many. But I think the fundamental thing is it's okay, and you should never feel ashamed for being you, and you are amazing, you are incredible, you are the person you're going to be with forever. And I think kind of we need to get into that understanding that we are the loves of our own lives, and you have to look after you. And fundamentally, however you present, however you feel, whatever your authentic identity, and this is something that I've learned as I've gotten older, because it's so hard when you're younger. And even at 30, I'm still not getting it right all the time, and I'm not always getting it right for me. But those people who genuinely love you will always love you, regardless of how you identify. And if you don't feel that's the case right now, you will find that tribe and you will find those people. But I would just really encourage, if you are listening to this podcast and this is resonating with you, speak to people around you who you trust, have those open conversations. And if you don't have those people, there are so many amazing charities and support groups out there. And through doing this research, I've just found so many incredible gender divergent kind of focus and support groups in so many areas of the UK. You are not the only person who feels this way. I promise you that. And I think it's just about, in whatever space feels safe and okay, it's about sharing that. And it's so hard to be open. And as a culture, we are terrible at it. People from the UK are awful at this. But I think it's just about sharing your feelings, because you're never, ever, ever alone. And that's the beauty, but also the hindrance of social media in the world we live in. But it is going to be okay, I promise. And fundamentally, there is just so much out there, and you never, ever have to suffer in silence, and you never have to feel like you can't be you, because I promise you, you is the best version, and people are going to love you and see you for you. And yes, it might feel really hard, but try and talk to people and explore in a safe place. And I think that's really, really important too. And it's okay to not know. It's okay to keep figuring it out. I think people kind of get to the end of their life and they still don't have it all figured out, and that's okay.
It's a beautiful message, a beautiful message of authenticity and found family, kind of hallmark of this community for a good reason. And I love the message that people can find each other, they can find family. And to
definitely
be their authentic self is gorgeous. Dr. Abby Vines, thank you so very much for having. One of my favorite people. Incredible to get to spend some time with you as always. And I'm so glad that our audience gets to hear from you and your incredible expertise. Thanks so very, very much. Dr. Abby Vines, everyone.
Thank you. And thank you again for having me.
Thanks so very much to Dr. Abigail Vines for spending some time with us, teaching us about what it's like at the intersection of gender diversity and neurodivergence, as she has gone and interviewed incredible young people about those experiences. And she's done a systematic review in the field looking at people who experience multiple marginalised identities of all kinds and what they share in terms of the difficulty in finding places to belong, in finding community, and in experiencing like a full reflection of both or all of their multiple marginalised identities in the world around them, rather than experiencing some to be magnified and some to be somewhat invisibilised. It's awesome that you got to spend some time with Abby. She's one of my favorite people. I was so fortunate to get to see her on stage in Vienna recently. She's an outstanding person to know, and I'm so glad you got to spend some time with her. And some of the messages that she had to give to us and to young people, to educators, to educational psychologists about how we might be able to create like spaces where lots of people who experience themselves to be marginalized can find a place to belong. I don't know about you, but the Gay Straight Alliance idea broadened to intersectional experiences, like an intersectional alliance, the Vines Intersectional Alliance, I think is a kick-ass idea. Personally, I love the notion that maybe we can all come together, not only as people who are marginalized, but also as people who are allies, who want to learn more, who want to ask questions, who want to create an education system, a school, a culture, create a world where everyone can find a place to belong. For sure, I'm going to see if I can create some intersectional alliances in my own practice. Such cool idea. I wonder if you might too. Thanks so very, very much for joining me. This is Classroom Psychology. It's so wonderful to have you here. And hey, you enjoy the podcast, share it with someone you love, right? Share it with people. Our community can only benefit from growing. It's already in 30 countries. Are you kidding me? And maybe there are more that people could find us in. Thanks so very much for joining me. This is Classroom Psychology. You're exceptionally welcome here. I'm your host, Cora, and I look forward to seeing you, as always, in the next one.